Welcome to Timeless Tales, where stories from history, myth, and the natural world come alive. Have you ever wondered why animals, including us, sometimes act with surprising kindness, even when it seems to go against the rules of survival? Or why evolution, often summed up as survival of the fittest, might actually favor behavior that looks selfless? Today, we're diving into a revolutionary idea that turned evolutionary thinking on its head: Richard Dawkins' the selfish gene. But don't let the title fool you, it's not about ego or personality. It's about zooming in, way in, to the level of our genes, and discovering that they may be the hidden architects behind our instincts and actions. So if you're curious about what really drives life, from sibling rivalry to parental love, from cooperation to conflict, stick with us. Joining us again are Maya Sinclair and Dr. Leo Hartman, who last time took us inside the world of chimpanzee politics. Today, they're back to explore what those power plays reveal about the evolution of family.
You know how it is, sometimes you've got all this info, articles, notes, and you just want to get straight to the point, right? Understand the core stuff without getting totally bogged down.
Yeah, avoid that information overload.
Exactly. And that's what we're doing today in this deep dive. We're going to unpack some, well, really powerful ideas, the kind that might just shift how you see things, hopefully a few aha moments along the way.
And our focus today is Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene. I mean, it's a landmark book. For a lot of people, it really flipped the script on evolution.
Flipped it how?
By arguing that the main player isn't the individual animal or the species, but the gene itself. That's the fundamental unit of natural selection, according to this view.
Okay, the gene. And that selfish part. It sounds a bit loaded, maybe.
It does, and we'll definitely get into that. But it's a surprisingly useful lens for understanding, well, all sorts of animal behavior, even things that look totally selfless, and maybe even bits of human culture, too.
Right, and our sources for this, they include some key bits from the 40th anniversary edition of the book itself, plus an analysis we looked at. So we're aiming to pull out the real nuggets for everyone.
Let's do it.
Okay, so first up is this big shift in viewpoint, gene versus individual.
Yeah, Dawkins kicks off with this idea that there are two ways to look at natural selection. Both are perfectly valid, just different angles. There's the gene's perspective and the individual organism's perspective.
And he uses that cube analogy, the Necker cube.
Exactly. That line drawing of a cube, you stare at it and it looks like it's facing one way.
And then suddenly, pop, it flips and it looks like it's facing the other way.
Right. And neither view is wrong. It's the same cube, the same lines. Dawkins says evolution is like that. The gene-centric view and the individual-centric view are both looking at the same neo-Darwinian reality.
But the gene view can show us things we might miss otherwise.
That's the argument. It can make certain things, like altruism, click into place more easily.
Okay, let's talk about that selfish label then. It's really important to clarify, this isn't about genes having personalities or motives, right?
Absolutely crucial. It's metaphorical, totally metaphorical. Selfish just means that genes act in ways that tend to increase their own chances of survival and replication down the generations.
So a gene that happens to build a body that's good at surviving and making copies, that gene will become more common?
Precisely. It's just about which genetic instructions are better at getting themselves copied into the next generation. No conscious plotting involved. It's an outcome, not an intention.
And these genes, they're not just stuck in one person or animal. They exist as copies across populations.
That's a key point. A gene is just a sequence of DNA. Copies of that sequence can exist in many different individuals. So from the gene's perspective, if you like, its goal is simply to get more numerous in the overall gene pool.
How does it do that?
By building good survival machines. That's another term Dawkins uses.
Survival machines. So, bodies. Like us.
Yep. Bodies, nervous systems, everything. Machines programmed by the genes to navigate the world, survive, and critically reproduce to pass on those genes.
Okay, and this is where altruism comes back in. Because if a gene exists in multiple bodies...
Exactly. Now you can see how a gene might benefit from helping copies of itself that happen to be sitting in other bodies.
Relatives, presumably.
Yes. This leads straight into kin selection. It tackles that paradox. Why would an animal risk itself for another?
From the individual's view, it seems crazy. Reduce your own chances.
Right. But from the gene's view, if helping another individual increases the chance that copies of your genes survive in that relative, then the selfish gene benefits.
So helping your brother or sister who shares roughly half your genes
is potentially a good strategy for those shared genes. The closer the relative, the higher the probability they share specific genes with you, and the stronger the evolutionary pressure for altruism towards them might be.
It's maths, basically. Hamilton's rule.
W.D. Hamilton provided that mathematical basis, yeah. It weighs the cost to the altruist against the benefit to the recipient, discounted by their degree of relatedness.
And you see this everywhere. Parental care is the obvious one.
The most obvious. A mother protecting her young. She's taking risks, sure, but her offspring carry half her genes. It's a massive investment from the gene's perspective.
The sources mentioned ground-nesting birds doing distraction displays, luring predators away.
Classic example. The parent bird risks itself, but potentially saves its offspring, who are carriers of its genes. It's gene selfishness manifesting as parental altruism.
And it scales with relatedness, you said.
Generally, yes. Siblings share, on average, 12 of their genes. Grandparents and grandchildren, uncles, aunts, nieces, nephews. That's usually around 14.
First cousins, too, right? Also 14.
Correct. Then it drops off. Third cousins might only share 100 and 128th of their genes beyond the baseline population average. Very little incentive for gene-driven altruism there.
So the book's example of finding mushrooms, you're more likely to call out to your brother nearby than some distant cousin.
That's the logic, yeah. The potential payoff for the shared genes is higher with the brother. It's a gene-level cost-benefit calculation, effectively.
Now, how does this compare to the older idea of group selection? That groups with self-sacrificing members do better?
Group selection was a popular idea, suggesting that traits evolve for the good of the group or species. But the orthodox view, the one Dawkins champions, is that gene-level selection is much more powerful.
Why is that?
Well, imagine a group of mostly altruistic individuals. If a single selfish individual arises or immigrates, they'll exploit the altruists. They get the benefits without paying the costs.
So the selfish trait would spread within the group, even if the group as a whole might eventually suffer.
Exactly. Selfishness beats altruism within groups. Altruism can only really evolve, according to this view, when it benefits the specific genes responsible for it, usually via kin or maybe reciprocity, which we can get to later. Group benefits are often just byproducts.
Okay, back to these survival machines, our bodies. Genes build them, program them.
Right, they're the master programmers, setting up the hardware and the basic operating system, you could say.
But we make decisions constantly. We learn, we adapt. It's not like genes are pulling strings moment to moment.
No, there's a time lag. Genes work over developmental timescales. Dawkins uses the analogy of a programmer setting up a chess-playing computer. The programmer gives it the rules, strategies, maybe some learning capacity.
But then has to let the computer actually play the game against its opponent in real time.
Precisely. Genes build the brain and nervous system, equip it with rules of thumb, learning abilities, maybe the capacity for simulation, thinking ahead. Then the nervous system makes the tactical, moment-to-moment decisions based on immediate circumstances.
So the brain takes over the executive function, kind of.
You could put it that way. Evolution favors brains that can make good policy decisions on the fly, rather than relying on rigid genetic instructions for every little thing.
And even a complex behavior, like, say, saving someone from drowning. A gene could influence that tendency, without being the only factor.
Yeah, the book uses a hypothetical like that, a gene for saving companions. It doesn't mean a single gene dictates the whole action, but a gene variant might slightly increase the probability of that behavior occurring in certain situations. If that tendency, on average, helps copies of the gene survive, maybe the rescued individuals or kin are likely to reciprocate, then the gene can spread.
Right. It's about statistical effects over populations. Now, these survival machines, they interact, often with conflicts of interest.
Oh, constantly. Predator and prey, that's an obvious conflict.
Yeah.
But also within species competition for food, territories, mates, it's inherent when resources are limited and everyone's trying to pass on their genes.
And this leads to strategies, like in aggression. You mentioned the hawk-dove game.
Yes, that's a key concept from game theory applied to evolution. The evolutionarily stable strategy, or ESS. It's a strategy that, if most members of a population adopt it, cannot be bettered by any rare alternative strategy.
So being an always aggressive hawk isn't necessarily the best.
Not if everyone else is a hawk. Then you just get constant, costly fighting. And being a passive dove is great if everyone else is a dove, but vulnerable to hawks. Often, the ESS is a mixed strategy, or a conditional one.
Like the retaliator.
Yeah, retaliator acts like a dove, initially doesn't start fights, but hits back hard if attacked. It can be a very stable strategy in certain conditions. It shows how behavior evolves based on its frequency and payoffs in the population.
Does this relate to things like dominance hierarchies, where animals sort out who's boss without fighting all the time?
Absolutely. Hierarchies can be seen as a kind of social ESS. They establish predictable relationships, reducing the need for constant, dangerous conflict over resources or mates, even though the underlying driver is still individual advantage.
You also mentioned genes complementing each other, like rowers in a boat.
Right. It's not always about competition between genes. Sometimes combinations of different genes work well together, like meeting both left and right-handed rowers for the boat to go straight. Selection can favor genes that function well as part of a team within the organism.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. The battle of the sexes. This starts with a really basic difference, doesn't it? Eggs versus sperm.
It does. That fundamental asymmetry is the starting point. Eggs are large, nutrient-rich, and relatively few. Sperm are tiny, mobile, and produced in vast numbers.
And that difference in initial investment cascades.
Big time. The female typically invests much more energy and resources just to produce the egg, and often in gestation or incubation, and then parental care. This difference shapes the evolution of male and female reproductive strategies.
So females are often the limiting resource for reproduction, and males might compete for access.
That's often the dynamic. And because females invest more per offspring, they may be more selective about mates. Males, with lower initial investment per potential offspring, might benefit evolutionarily from seeking more mating opportunities.
Which can lead to conflict over how much parental care each sex provides. The female potentially being exploited if the male deserts.
That's one potential outcome, yes. The differing optimus for male and female reproductive success can lead to these conflicts. And there's also parent-offspring conflict.
Conflict between parent and child.
So-
How so?
Well, a parent shares only 50% of genes with any one offspring. They need to allocate resources not just to this child, but potentially to future children too, to maximize their overall gene transmission.
But the child is 100% related to itself.
Exactly. So the offspring might be selected to demand more parental investment, food, care, protection, than is optimal for the parent to give from the parent's long-term reproductive perspective. Think of weaning conflicts, for instance.
Fascinating. Okay, let's jump from genes to memes. Dawkins' idea about cultural evolution.
Right. He needed a term for a unit of cultural replication, analogous to the gene. So, meme.
And what counts as a meme?
Ideas, tunes, fashions, catchphrases, ways of building things, beliefs. Basically, any unit of cultural information that can be passed from brain to brain.
Through imitation, learning, language.
Uh-huh. Memes replicate themselves by getting lodged in minds and then being transmitted to other minds. Some memes are better replicators than others.
Like a catchy song that gets stuck in everyone's head. Or a powerful idea like, well, the book mentions the idea of God or life after death.
Yes, those are presented as examples of very successful memes. They have high survival value in the meme pool, the cultural environment. Maybe because they offer comfort, explanation, or social cohesion. They tap into our psychology.
But meme replication is way messier than gene replication, surely. Ideas change as they spread.
Oh, absolutely. There's much lower fidelity. Memes mutate, blend, get misinterpreted all the time. The units aren't as discrete as genes often are. But the core Darwinian process replication, variation selection Dawkins argues that still applies in the cultural realm.
And memes and genes, can they clash?
Definitely. Think of celibacy as promoted by some religious memes. From a gene's perspective, celibacy is reproductive suicide, but the meme for celibacy can thrive if it encourages individuals to dedicate their lives to spreading the meme complex, like the religion itself.
But humans aren't just slaves to our genes or memes, are we? He mentions foresight.
Yes, that's a crucial point he makes. Our capacity for conscious thought, planning, and simulation allows us, potentially, to understand these replicators and even rebel against their dictates. We can use contraception, defying our gene's desire for replication. We can question and discard memes.
That feels important. Okay, another really mind-bending idea. The extended phenotype. Genes reaching beyond the body.
Yeah, this takes the gene's eye view even further. The phenotype is usually thought of as the physical characteristics of an organism, eye color, height, etc. The extended phenotype is the idea that a gene's effects can extend far outside the body wall.
How does that work? Give me an example.
The classic one is the caddisfly larva building its little house out of stones and twigs.
Right, I remember that.
Dawkins argues that the genes influencing the behavior of selecting specific stones and cementing them together are expressing themselves in the non-living environment. The house's properties, its strength, its camouflage, are part of the phenotype produced by those genes.
So the artifact, the house, is like an extension of the organism's genes. Wow.
That's the idea. If a gene affects wing shape, we call that phenotype. If it affects web design in a spider, why not call the web part of the extended phenotype?
And parasitism fits here too.
Perfectly. Think of a parasite's genes manipulating the host's behavior for the parasite's benefit. Like the lancet fluke making an ant climb a blade of grass to get eaten by a sheep.
Okay, creepy. But the ant's altered behavior is an extended phenotype of the fluke's genes.
Exactly. Or a cuckoo chick manipulating its foster parents to feed it. The foster parent's behavior is being influenced by the cuckoo's genes. It really drives home that the gene is the fundamental unit whose effects we should track wherever they occur.
It dissolves the boundary of the individual organism in a way.
It does. It forces you to focus on the gene and its total reach.
Okay, last big topic. Cooperation beyond kin. We talked about kin selection, helping relatives. But what about helping unrelated individuals? Reciprocal altruism.
Right, proposed by Robert Trivers. This is the you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours principle. It can evolve if individuals interact repeatedly, can recognize each other, and remember past interactions.
So I help you today, expecting you'll help me tomorrow.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
There's a cost to helping now, but a potential future benefit when the favor is returned.
The prisoner's dilemma game is the classic model here, isn't it?
It is. It highlights the tension between cooperating for mutual benefit and defecting for individual gain, potentially leading to a worse outcome for both.
If it's just a one-off game, defecting seems rational.
It does. But if the game is played repeatedly, the iterated prisoner's dilemma, then strategies based on reciprocity can flourish.
Like tit for tat. That came out on top in Axelrod's tournaments.
Famously so. Start by cooperating, then just copy what the other player did last time. It's nice because it's never the first to defect.
But it retaliates immediately if the other defects.
Right, it's retaliatory. But it's also forgiving if the other player switches back to cooperation. Tit for tat cooperates on the next move. And it's clear, easy for the opponent to figure out.
So niceness, retaliation, forgiveness, clarity, those seem key.
Axelrod found those were characteristics of the most successful strategies. The shadow of the future, knowing you'll interact again, is crucial for this kind of cooperation to evolve.
You mentioned the WWI truce example.
Yeah, the live and let live system that spontaneously emerged in some trenches. Soldiers stopped shooting directly at each other based on a kind of tit-for-tat reciprocity, even against orders. It shows cooperation emerging even between enemies when interactions are repeated.
And in nature, vampire bats sharing blood.
That's a famous example.
Yeah.
Bats that have successfully fed will sometimes regurgitate blood for unrelated bats that failed to feed, but crucially, they tend to share with those who have shared with them in the past.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping this up, we've gone from the gene's eye view to kin selection, explaining family altruism, survival machines, evolutionarily stable strategies.
The battle of the sexes rooted in gamete differences, the whole idea of memes as cultural replicators, genes reaching beyond the body with the extended phenotype.
And finally, how cooperation like tit for tat can evolve even between non-relatives through reciprocity. It's quite a journey.
It really is. And understanding these concepts, even just the basics, gives you such a powerful toolkit for thinking about why the living world, including us, is the way it is.
It definitely makes you look at behavior differently. So maybe a final thought for our listeners. As you go about your day, maybe just notice some interactions. Could be people, could be animals on TV, whatever. And just ask yourself, could this selfish gene perspective shed any light on what's going on here, even if it feels counterintuitive?
Yeah, where might seemingly selfless or even strange behaviors fit into this framework? It's fascinating to think about.
Definitely food for thought. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive.
And that wraps up today's journey through the selfish gene and the surprising roots of our most human instincts. A big thank you to Dr. Leo Hartman and Maya Sinclair for sharing their insights and for showing us how the ancient dance between genes and behavior shapes everything from family bonds to chimpanzee alliances. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and join us next time on Timeless Tales, where we'll continue exploring the hidden forces that connect us to the past and to each other. Until then, stay curious.